Welcome to video number 2 in the series of the Mark IV 01M automatic to manual swap. This video is going to be an in-depth look at the wiring that we need to do. There'll be a couple other things that we do, but this is in-depth look at wiring, and I'm going to go step by step, connection by connection, circuit by circuit. So this should cover pretty well what you won't be able to find in the Bentley manual, in other videos, other resources out there, because this is very specific to making this car into a manual. In this example, I'm putting in a 6-speed into this 2003 TDI, but the 5-speed is almost identical as far as the wiring is concerned and the location of the different connectors. Majority of the wiring we're going to do is the same for all of the cars, whether it's the VR6, the 1.8, the 2.0, the TDI. But there are a couple of things that are important, and I'll bring those out as we're going through the video. So with that being said, let's get over to my whiteboard where I have a diagram prepared, and we'll go step by step through the circuits. Then we'll come back out into the shop here and we will look at where all those connections are on the car. Welcome to my whiteboard diagram. The wiring that we need to do to switch to the manual transmission is kind of intimidating and seems really complicated at first, but it really isn't that bad. And we're going to break it down into individual circuits and then individual locations to try to simplify it. I'm going to do my best to be slow and methodical and clear, and we'll go through the diagram of what all we need to do. Let me start with, I figured this circuitry out with the Bentley manual, and I can't recommend the Bentley manual enough. There are better manuals out there, but they're way more expensive. Bentley, I believe, is about 120 bucks on Amazon now. It comes in 2 volumes, and the wiring diagrams in the back of volume 2 is where you're going to find this information. It's not 100%. There are a few things that aren't listed, or are the color code is different or something. So sometimes you still got to verify it. Get a good multimeter so that you can do continuity checks without sending voltage before you put 12 volts to the wrong pin on your ECU and fry it. Bentley manual. Get it, learn how to read it. It is a little bit confusing if you haven't read electrical diagrams before. Spend a couple minutes getting familiar with it. It'll pay off in the long run. Not to mention, for the rest of whatever you're doing on your car, torque specs, putting the suspension in, doing the CV axles, all that, this is a great place to find that stuff. So I highly recommend spending the money. Disclaimer number 2 is, this is what I did, this is what works for me. I've wired a few cars this way. I can't guarantee that it's going to work for everybody watching the video, particularly with all the variations in engines and transmissions and years of cars, different equipment on different cars. It's fairly standard through all the cars. Where there are pin differences that I am aware of, I'll point them out. This particular diagram is for a 2003 ALH, so it applies to the 99.5 until they went to the BEW in late 2003. For those with gasser engines, it'll be very, very similar, but a couple of the pin numbers might be different. The main focus of our safety interlock is the same on all the different model years, although sometimes the pins and color codes get swapped, but we'll talk through that here in a minute. So for our wiring, we have 3 circuits that we need to deal with. The cruise control or cruise control interrupt, the safety start or the clutch safety switch, starter interlock, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same circuit, and then the backup lights, or sometimes called reverse lights. Those are the 3 circuits we're going to do, and there's basically 3 different locations that we're going to be working on wiring for those 3 circuits. First one is under the dashboard in the relay panel. And then of course we have in the engine bay on the transmission where the connections are made to the transmission. And then the third location is in the plenum chamber which is underneath the wipers, that cowl at the base of the windshield. So that's kind of the 3 locations, and I'll try to point out where these connections are made as we're going. Let me emphasize, when you start with this wiring and you have wires cut and laying around, it's important not to have any voltage on them. So before I start any of this, the battery is out of the car. So here on my diagram, in the center is the 175 relay that all of this centers around, and most of the functions in the automatic that we're dealing with happen through this one relay. So it's the 175 relay, and once we start talking about the color codes on it, you'll be able to identify that underneath your dashboard. There should be only one 175 relay under there, but it is possible there is another. It's a pretty big relay, and it has 9 pins on it. All right, the relay we're going to replace it with is a 53, right? And that's a pretty basic 4-prong, pretty standard relay. Sometimes they came in gray and sometimes they came in black. It doesn't matter. 53 relay is what we're going to plug back into this once we're done with our wiring. Okay, the connector for that relay obviously is a 9-pin connector, and the pins are numbered, but it's really hard to read them. They're numbered on the face where the relay plugs in. So the first thing I do when I start working on it, once I get it pulled out of the relay panel and out where I can kind of get to it, I take a pen and write my relay, I write the pin numbers with a pen, sorry for my southern accent, on the outside so that I can reference it easily later. I spend way too much time on the first couple with a magnifying glass trying to read those little tiny numbers, and they get a little dirt in them and then you can't read them. So I highly recommend, first thing you do is take you a nice map pen or something and write on the outside what those pin numbers are so you can reference it later. So let me orient you a little bit to what we have on the whiteboard here, and we're going to take the circuits one at a time to go through them. But just so you understand what's on the board, in the center here is the 9-pin relay that we were just talking about. Off to the left here is the white clutch switch. That is going to be our new clutch safety interlock or start interlock switch, so that you cannot start the car unless the clutch is pushed in. Down here is the starter. Here's the blue clutch switch, which is the cruise control switch. So the safety interlock switch is this gray or white switch that goes on top of the clutch pedal. The cruise control interrupt switch is this blue one, right, referred to as the blue switch. And you can see there's a plunger here on the gray one. So when you push the pedal, the clutch pedal down, this will push the plunger in and let power go to the starter. So when you turn the ignition, the starter will work. When the clutch is up, you won't be able to start the car. The blue switch, you can't really see the plunger under there, but when the clutch is up, it pushes that plunger in and provides power to the cruise control in the ECU. And then when you push the clutch down, that plunger pops out, interrupts power, and so the cruise control will turn off. So that's the blue switch here. Across the top, we have our backup lights we got to deal with. We have the 8-pin connector that goes to the automatic transmission, which we're going to cut off and use a wire or two from it. It's kind of a D shape, and it's an 8-pin connector. We have our backup switch, which is on the transmission. It's a 2-pin, so this is the connector that when we got our transmission, we got the connector also, 2-wire that goes, it's close to the shift tower on the transmission. Then of course in the plenum chamber we have the TCU and the ECU, all right, and the TCU is going to go away so we can undo that wire bundle that goes to it, and that will help us identify some of these wiring circuits. So let's start off with, what do we not mess with in this relay? Because once we put that 53 relay in there, there's a couple functions that are really important. pin 2, 6, and 8. Do not mess with them. That's why they're in red. They're easy to identify. Pin 2 is a large gauge red wire that goes to the battery. Pretty easy to pick that one out from the bundle. It's fatter than the rest, all right, and that brings 12 volt power into the relay. On pin 6, you may have 2 or it may be 1. They're smaller gauge, red with a black stripe wire that goes to the ignition switch. And then in pin 8, comes down to the starter, is this heavy gauge red with a black stripe. So the function there is you turn the ignition switch that connects the relay so that the battery power comes through the relay and goes to the starter. Starter turns over, starts the engine. That's what we want to leave alone. Okay. So the clutch switches and this relay are under the dash in the car. So kind of this section is in the dash. The TCU and the ECU are in the plenum chamber. And then the backup switch on the transmission and the connector to the automatic transmission that we're going to steal some wires from, that is in the engine bay also. So this is kind of engine bay, plenum chamber, under the dash. Okay, let's start with the backup lights. So the backup switch is going on the transmission, and we're going to have a connector that looks about like that, 2-pin. All right, 2-pin meaning it has 2 wires coming out of it. We're going to take that 8-pin connector that we took off of the automatic transmission. Pin number 3 on that 8-pin connector is a black with a green stripe wire. We're going to cut that right at the connector, leave ourselves plenty of wire, and bring that down to our connector that's going to go to the switch that's mounted on the transmission for the backup lights. The other wire, and it really doesn't matter which way you go because it's simply a continuity switch, right? It's either open or closed, so it doesn't matter which way the current flows. We're going to take pin 8 off of that 8-pin connector, which is a red and yellow wire. Cut that right at the connector. And that connects to the other wire on your backup switch connector. Now this connector plugs in on the transmission in the left front, kind of the driver's side front, kind of right behind the headlight, underneath the battery, that corner of the transmission. So you want to leave yourself wiring and add it if you need to, add a little wire to make sure that you can get that connector to that corner. Conversely, if you leave too much wiring, now you're going to have to coil it up. So that 8-pin connector, really the wiring comes out underneath the battery. So it's pretty easy to figure out how much wire you need to leave and make sure that connector reaches where you need it to go. All right, so that's step 1 for the backup lights, but we're not done yet. That is done obviously in the engine bay. Now under the dash, we're going to take the red and yellow that comes from pin 1 on our 175 relay holder. We're going to cut that off right at the relay holder. We're going to cut it right here. And then we're going to take pin 4, which is the black with blue stripe. And we're going to leave ourselves a little bit of pigtail because we need to use both of these wires. We're going to leave a little pigtail, cut that sucker about there. The relay end, so where this wire is coming from, I've cut it. I'm going to attach that to the red and yellow wire that we just cut off pin 1. So we're going to make that connection there. We've cut that there and cut that there. So now how this circuit works is that black and green wire that we cut off from pin 3 that provides 12 volt power from the fuse box. That comes into the backup switch. When you put the transmission into reverse, it makes a connection in that switch, and now power will travel on that wire, the red and yellow wire that we cut off from pin 8, and into that blue and black wire that's already existing in the car and flows back to the backup lights. Now, when we get to, there's one more piece to this. When we get to the TCU, we're going to unhook the TCU. So this branch of the yellow-red wire that goes to the TCU, when the TCU is unplugged, that will go away and we don't have to worry about it. But when we unplug that, we do want to isolate it so that it's not 12 volt loose wire flapping around in the plenum chamber. That black with blue stripe wire that was on pin 4 that we cut to do the backup lights, now we have this little bit hanging out. We're going to go to one of the wires on the gray switch that goes on top of the clutch. So we'll make this connection here. Right? We cut that in our last step. Then we're going to take pin number 7 off the starter, off this interlock relay, which is the brown ground wire. And all that wire does is go to a ground. So we're going to cut that off right here at the base of the connector and connect that to the other wire on this clutch safety switch. So that's pretty simple, and that completes the clutch safety switch. So here's how that clutch safety circuit is going to work now that we've completed the connections. You turn the key in the ignition, that provides power into the relay. But if the relay is not grounded, nothing will happen. When the clutch is pressed in, that white clutch switch connects pin 4 to ground, and now current will flow through the relay, which will connect the battery to the starter, and the engine will turn over. So it's really pretty simple. It's just important, obviously, to get the right wires. Our next circuit is the blue cruise control interrupt switch that's going to go on the clutch. Once we install the clutch pedal, we start off under the dash by taking pin 9, which is the yellow and blue wire. That's right here. We're going to cut that right at the relay connector. So that yellow and blue wire, cut it at pin 9. Now, this next step, I'm going to jump back and forth a couple times because there are multiple yellow and blue wires in the engine bay and in the plenum chamber. So we want to make sure that we're getting the right one. And sometimes this wire is a different color. So when you look at pin 9, keep track of what color that is. Go into the engine bay to the TCU. It should be yellow and blue, comes up to the TCU at pin 11. All right. If it's not yellow and blue here, whatever color it is there, obviously it should be the same color there. So we know we're going to take that TCU out, so it's no big deal. Go ahead and cut that wire at the TCU connector. Now, just to make sure we've got this right, I'm going to take an extension on my multimeter and I'm going to continuity check from this yellow and blue inside the car to the TCU. All right, just because I want to make sure that I got the right wires and I'm not frying anything. All right, confirmed it, got continuity. I'm going to take that yellow and blue wire and connect it to one of the wires on the blue clutch safety switch, the blue cruise control switch. All right, so under the dash, making sure you leave enough pigtail that this is going to reach over to where the clutch is going to be. We're going to connect this to that yellow and blue wire. Easy enough so far. Then we're going to take pin 5, which is the center. Pin 5 is the center here. and that's going to be a black with green stripe. So that comes out of the center of this relay. You can double check that one because it's 12 volt. When the ignition is on, it should be providing 12 volts. We're going to cut that off right at the relay. So we're going to cut that off right here, right where it comes out. There it is. All right, that's the black with green. Snip it right there. Run that pigtail over to the other wire on your blue clutch safety switch. Again, make sure you have enough pigtail there or enough wire that you can get that switch, the pigtail to it, to plug it in when it's mounted on the clutch pedal. So pin 5 gets cut and goes down to the blue clutch cruise control clutch switch. Okay, so now the dashboard wiring of the cruise control is done. So now we just need to connect the cruise control to the ECU. So this next bit is going to be working in the plenum chamber. It seems a little bit intimidating and complicated, but it really isn't that bad. But just take your time and don't be afraid to stop and continuity check wires that you're not sure of. Okay, I used a particular wire that goes from pin 13 on the TCU to pin 19 on the ECU. In reality, there's probably 15 different wires you could choose. All of the wires that come from the TCU to the ECU are going to go away because the TCU is going away. So you could use any of those wires, and if you unwrap the tape of the wiring harness between the ECU and the TCU, it's pretty simple to trace those. But let's go ahead and pick one and use it, and then we can identify those numbers. If you are on a different engine than the ALH, double check that whatever wire you're using, and in this case I'm talking about pin 19 on the ECU, and make sure it goes to the TCU. If it doesn't go to the TCU, don't use it. Leave it alone. If you can verify that the wire you're going to use is between the TCU and the ECU, then it doesn't matter because all that's going to be disconnected anyway. 13 to pin 19 on the ECU is a yellow and red wire, not to be confused with the yellow and red that red and yellow that we used out of pin 1. What we're trying to accomplish is get signal from this blue clutch switch to the ECU. The ECU has very specific pins, right? And you probably don't have one, but you have a bunch of wires that are not going to be used now. So we're going to take apart the ECU connector, pull pin 19 out, and put it into pin 66. Let me stomp my foot because this is important. That's for the ALH engine. If you have a gas engine, you're going to use a different pin number, and I will cover those here in a minute. We'll talk about the other engines. The ALH motor from 99.5 to 2003 is pin 66 on the ECU. So we're going to take pin 19, we're going to unplug it, don't cut it, because we need that pin, right? And you poke the little thing and it slides out, and we'll go over that later when we're at the car. We're going to take pin 19 out and plug it into 66. Then we're going to cut that wire at the TCU, right here, and we're going to connect it to the yellow and blue wire that is coming from pin 9 to the TCU. So another way to say what I just did, at the TCU you could cut wire 11 and 13, pins 11 and 13, and wire them together at the TCU. So if we did this circuitry correct, now the cruise control switch should have 12 volt coming into it, and then the wire coming out should be a yellow and blue to a yellow and red going into ECU pin 66. So I get tons of requests off these videos. Hey, can you do me a wiring diagram for my car? Da 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 da. It's this year, that da 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 da. It takes a couple hours to make one of these. So no, can't do that for free. But I will give you the important part here, and I will recommend that you get the Bentley manual, as I mentioned before. Here's the pins that you're gonna have to find for a couple of different cars. One of the cool things about the VWs is all the gas engines are the same. So for all the Mark IVs, the 1.8, the 2.0, and the VR6, those three engines, the cruise control goes to pin 39 on the ECU. So this pin 66 on the ALH, you use pin 39 on the gas engines. All right, the wire that you take doesn't matter as long as it was coming from the TCU. So you can figure this out even without the Bentley, but I'm still recommending you get the Bentley. Okay, and if I can pan down without making everybody sick. There we go. All right, so the gas engines, cruise control goes to pin 39. For the early ALH engines, 97, 98, 99 and a half, well, the early 99s, it's pin 46. And this is true. Beetles, Golfs, Jettas, wagons. So the early ALH is pin 46. Late ALH engines, and ALHs are the early TDIs, right? It's pin 66, as in our example here. And then the later TDI, the BEW, it's pin 43 that you want to provide the power into the ECU for cruise control. So that should save you some time. Okay, for those of you with ALHs that are like, hey, I want to verify that stuff in the Bentley. Where did you get it in the Bentley? This diagram for the ALH came from 97,681 and 97,685. And that's the ALH automatic and the ALH manual. And then you compare those two charts to figure out what you need to connect where. This one has that wire, this one does not have that wire. Let me add one more piece to this. If you go to add a wire to pin 39 on a gasser, pin 46 on an early ALH, pin 66 on a late ALH, or pin 43 on a BEW, if there is already a wire in that, something is wrong. Don't put more power to it. All right? Something is off. It's been altered. Maybe somebody started. Who knows what it is? Maybe I read the diagram wrong. But if there is already a wire in the pin that you're trying to put manual cruise control to, stop and figure out what is wrong before you put 12 volts or cut a circuit that is important. So here's a zoom in for a minute or so of the diagram after we completed it. So if you want to pause the video and double check or copy something down. All right, here we are going under the dash by the pedals, the driver's side. I move the steering wheel up and out as far as I can to give myself as much room, and move the seat back, and I put a garbage bag on it because I get so dirty and I don't want to get the seat nasty. And then a light. So let's see if we can get in here and film what we're trying to do. Squeaky door. We have the knee panel is already removed and the bottom panel, and then the boot just removes with two black kind of nuts that you actually use a flathead screwdriver, just because you drop a nut and it always goes behind that boot. So be ready for that. Up here is the fuse panel, and there you can see our 175 relay. So there's a couple different ways to attempt this, and it kind of depends on how much stuff is in your way. This isn't too bad for getting at that 175 relay. If you have to, there's a 10mm nut right there, tip of my finger, just to the right of the 377 relay. And then there's another one that I can't quite get a camera angle on, to the left of that 53 relay, way down to the left up in here. You can take those two nuts off and this whole relay panel will slide towards you, and then you can drop it down. Sometimes that gives you a little more room. But in this case, I think I'll be able to just remove the relay and then unclip the relay base and let it hang down underneath here. So if I pull the relay and I look at, remember how it's oriented, so if you go to plug it back in, you can remember which way it goes. Just pull it straight back like that. Now, if we push these two tabs, focus, there we go, that tab and that tab, this will push back and we can pull it out the back and drop it down. So you can see here, I've got that clutch holder out, pushed the two tabs there and there, pushed it back, and then reached behind and wound it around so I can get it out here to get the best access. Then I looked with my magnifying glass at the face of it so I could read the pin numbers, and then wrote those on the side. So there's pins 7, 4, and 1, 7, 8, 9. Wrote it all the way around so that I don't have to keep getting the magnifying glass out to figure out which pins are which. Okay, here we are looking underneath the dash again at the relays. So you can see I cut for the white switch pins 4, the blue and black, to one of the wires that connect to the white clutch switch. The other one goes to that ground. There's that brown wire, that's the ground that came from pin 7. Right, so that was one of the circuits we needed to complete here. That blue and black we cut off and used that for the backup lights. So here you can see the blue and black connected to the red and yellow from pin 1. So that's kind of pin 4 connected to pin 1 there. And then for the blue cruise control switch, we took the yellow with blue that came from pins 5 and pin 9. The yellow and blue came from pin 9, and this 12 volt black with green stripe, all right, those two go to the blue switch. And I checked these pigtails to make sure that once the clutch is installed, I have enough wire to get to it. So that pretty much finishes it up in here. The next step is to wind this back around behind the panel, pop it back in, and then don't forget to put the 53 relay in it. I have made that mistake before, and it's kind of embarrassing that you think you got everything done and you try to start the car and it won't start. And now you're frustrated. Well, all it was you skipped the step of actually plugging the relay in once this relay holder is plugged back in to the bracket there. So that wraps it up under here. So here the TCU is out. This is the TCU. There was 2 Phillips screwdrivers, 2 Phillips screws in each of those holes that went down through those 2 tabs. Took those screws out, pushed it back, pulled it forward to disengage the rear there, and then slid it to the side up over the air filter, and then I was able to pull it out. Here is the harness, the connector, and this is the slider that I can't do one-handed. Now to open this harness, there's a zip tie that will be around here. Just clip that zip tie, much like we'll do on this ECU connector here in a moment. We're going to clip that zip tie. Push these little tabs here, and that cover should lift up on that end, and now we slide it towards the T-handle and it'll slide out. Now we can see our wires. On the face of it, a few of the pin numbers are written. You can kind of see the 1 on the upper left here by my thumb. You can see that's a 1. And if we can get the glare right, you can see way over to the right there is pin 23. So the 3 pins that I'm looking for are 11, 13, and 18. And I just put a red dot by each of those so I don't have to count all the pin numbers every time. So I know that's 11, that's 13, and this is 18. So in my wiring diagram, I didn't talk about pin 18. But when I checked the color codes of the wires that came into 11 and 13, I was expecting to find a yellow with blue stripe coming into 13. And it is this red with gray stripe. All right, so that's not the right one, but there is a red with gray stripe that goes into the relay that we're messing with. The yellow with red stripe was pin 11 as expected, but the pin that the wire that I want to use, I was looking for that yellow with blue, and here I see there's only one yellow with blue wire, and that's to pin 18. So what I'm going to do is cut this wire and do a continuity check back to the relay under the dash and make sure that that is the same yellow with blue stripe wire that goes into the relay, because that's the one I'm planning to use to connect over to this ECU. So we're going to double check that that's the right wire because it's a little bit different than our diagram. Now the good thing about the TCU connector is all of that stuff goes away, so I'm really not worried if I cut the wrong wire, if there's any problem, as long as I don't plug it into the wrong thing. But I could cut all of these wires off this TCU connector and it's not going to be an issue. However, I like the way it keeps the wires isolated, so I plan on leaving all the wires into it except that the ones that I need to use, and then I'm going to wrap it up in tape and shove it up underneath there to keep those out of the water and keep them from grounding out. There are a couple here that are going to have voltage on them when the harness is running. This red with a white stripe probably will have voltage when the ignition is on, and this you can't really see it at the very end here is a black with green stripe. That's usually a 12-volt lead. So I like the way this keeps it insulated. So we'll wrap it up in plastic and tape it up and tuck it up underneath once I'm done finding the pins and wires that I need. Here we are at the base of the windshield looking at the ECU connector. This is the 121 pin ECU connector that was connected right there. So here's the ECU connector. We're going to get this cover off. Cut that zip tie, being careful not to cut any wires. This end just pulls up. Sometimes you got to squeeze it just a little bit, and that'll disengage those teeth that go into the other end. Save that because we need to put this back on when we're done. And here we can see the wires that go into it. Now we need to get this connector apart. And in general, VW connectors have a pink kind of a safety lock. So you'll see there's one at the top there, and there's also one here. So this one, we're just going to gently lever in here with a screwdriver. Don't force anything, and that should pull out. Save that because we're going to need it when we put this all back together. And then we're going to gently pull this one up with pliers, making sure we don't pull a wire. Sometimes you have to work the harness a little bit for it to come out. Alright, that should be enough to let us get it out. Now we should be able to pull these plugs out like so. There we go. Save this piece because we're going to need that when we put it back together. Now, it's really small and really hard to see, but the pin numbers, a few of them, are on this face here. So there's a, I believe that's a 3. I'll have to get my magnifying glass out, but we can then count over to the pin numbers that we need. And of course, we'll have one down here too. Okay, really hard to get this on film, but the pin numbers are printed for the first and last in each row. And if I get the light just right, you'll see that first pin is number 6. And at that first pin is number 6, and that last pin is pin 24, if I get the light just right there. All right, I'm looking for pin 19, which is a yellow with a red stripe. So I'm going to count over here. 6. So there's 19, and sure enough, there's a yellow with red stripe. So I'm going to take my pick and stick it in to bend that tab back just a little bit. You know what, before we do that, let's pull the rubber seal back so I can get a good grip on it. We're just going to pull it back up the wires a little bit here. Is that pin 19 right? This one right there. So we're going to try to release it by sticking my pick in there like that, and then hold that tab back. While we pull that wire up, and you can see the wire coming out. There we go. There's pin 19. So now we can put this back together, and we need to put it into pin 66. So it's the other connector. This one goes 6 through 24, and then 25 through 43. So we need to go to the white connector here to find where pin 66 should go. Okay. There's pin 44, and there's pin 62. So we flip it over and we should see pin 63 on one end. There's 63. So there's 63, 64, 65, 66. So we need to put it in here, but there is a blanking pin in there. So we're going to try to take that out. Release it the same that you would if there was a wire on it. Slowly work this back so I have a little bit of room. Okay, and I'm taking note that that wire next to it is this white wire. So here's 66 that I'm taking out. This is 66 I'm taking out. Remember that white wire in 67, because I need to go into the hole right next to it. So now I can pull this out, and now we know where pin 66 goes. So okay, before I can get that pin in, there is a plug through that rubber seal, so I have to see if I can There we go. I'm just putting a pick through the hole there so I can get the pin back down there. Alright, the yellow and red that we took out from 19. Alright, the yellow and red that's going into 66 comes through. Now I need to check the orientation so that that little locking tab will hold. Alright, this guy is being a little bit tricky for me, but I'm taking it pretty easy. You can see I got it turned so it's in the right orientation. Look at how these other pins are in, so that that little locking tab will sit in here the way these others do. You can just barely see that little locking tab, and of course that has to be pointed the correct direction for it to lock in place. And we need it to sit down into that slot and then slide in. We gotta make sure we get it all the way down in there and engaged. So when you plug the ECU in, it doesn't come off. And it makes a good connection. There we go. There we go. Alright, I'm going real gentle with the pliers there. Alright, so now I'm going to give it a little tug. And I'm pulling on it and it's not coming out. So now we have wire 66 or pin 66 filled. So we'll put this seal back down the way we want it. And we're ready to assemble this connector. Before I put this all back together, let's do a quick continuity check. So I have one lead hooked to the yellow with red stripe wire. And now I'm going to put the other lead onto the pin we just put in and make sure we got continuity here. Alright, excellent. Now we can put that connector back together. So I cut back the tape here a little bit to give me just a little more slack in that wire, because I really don't want it to pull out or break it. So now we'll slide that guy back in. Now we need our pink retainers back. I'll separate those wires just a little bit so I can get to the slot where it goes. Make sure we get the wires on the inside of the clips. And now we'll put the other one back in here. Got that reassembled. So now I'm going to rewrap this portion down here and then put the cover back on and put that zip tie around, and then we'll be all done with the ECU connector. Okay, got the harness rewrapped, so now we're just going to put the cover back on. There's 2 little teeth there that engage up front, and then 4 teeth around the circumference that engage inside, and then we put that zip tie around it. So we start off here by getting those engaged, and then as you bring it down, make sure you're not pinching a wire. And that clip engaged, that clip engaged. All right, so all we got to do is run a zip tie here. Make sure you do not zip tie around the sliding handle. I'll show you here in a second. Clip that off to be a little bit tidy. This needs to be able to slide back and forth, so make sure you don't get that zip tie around there. So now we open it up, start it back into the ECU connector, and then as you push in a little bit, I'm going to push with my left thumb here, and that cam action will pull it down on, and it should sit level with the other connector across there. If you didn't get it engaged all the way, it won't be level. So there, we're done with the ECU wiring. Now we can go back and finish the TCU. Okay, so here we are looking at the TCU connector, and the yellow with blue stripe wire that surprised me because it was on pin 18. I continuity checked with the relay underneath the dash, and that's why I've got the clip on it here, and that is indeed the correct wire. And since the TCU isn't going to be plugged in here anymore, I don't care if it came from something else, as long as it has continuity and it's the correct wire going back to that relay. This is the wire that we just put in, changed the pin on the ECU. So now I'm going to join those two, and then we'll be done with the TCU, and I'll wrap this all up nice and watertight. Remember, you can go back as far as you want on this harness because none of these wires do anything or provide any signal. Just remember, a couple of them do carry 12 volt. So if you really wanted to be tidy in here, you could peel that harness back all the way over to the plenum chamber and cut all those wires out if you wanted to bother doing that. It won't save you much weight. It's not something that you'll ever see, so I am choosing not to do it, but I am going to wrap this up nicely and tuck it up underneath. You could leave this plugged into the TCU and leave the TCU up in there. That would be fine. 6 of one, half dozen the other. The TCU really doesn't weigh anything, and it will hold this watertight because that connector is a watertight connector. So that's not a bad idea either. Okay, looking down into the driver's side front of the car, right, where the battery and battery box normally sit right here. Here's the connector for the backup switch that goes on the transmission. Check your connector before you solder it, crimp it, heat it, however you do your connectors. Make sure it's the right one. I took the 5-pin connector, the 8-pin connector. Here we go. There's the 8-pin connector. I cut off pin 3, the red with yellow, and the black with green is 3, and that's 8. Cut those two off as we have previously discussed, and attach them to the 2 wires here. Made sure I had enough wire that I can plug it in. That switch will end up almost right underneath this. So I've got plenty of wire to make it. I put some extra shrink tubing on there. I'm going to put a little dot of silicone in each end slide that up over and shrink wrap that so it'll be nice and tidy and weatherproof. The rest of the wires we can just cut off. This connector, there is no voltage carried, and these all connect to the TCU. So that big heavy cable, you can cut that off right here where it comes out of this cable chase. All right, so we can cut that off right here. These other two connectors, we can do the same, but we're going to isolate those wires just in case there's voltage carried on these two. Actually, there's a third one somewhere here. And then we'll cut the rest of the wires back on the 8-pin connector. So that completes our backup light in the front here. One last thing while we're here, I wouldn't button all of this up until we test it. I have done that before, had a problem, and ended up having to take the wipers off and the cowl cover off and everything back off to troubleshoot. So I recommend leaving open what you can. Obviously you want connectors and wires protected, but I'm not going to put this all back together until I test it. So that's it for the engine bay wiring.